Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'll be speaking French to ensure we have language biodiversity within slow food as well, and to avoid globish becoming a language form of fast food. And then you obviously have the Belgians, the Canadians, the French participants to take into account. We're going to have multiple languages. There'll be Italian and English. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the absence of Elena Granatac, who is not here today, but this will give us more time for our other two speakers, Elena Granata. And I'd like to say to all the young people in the hall how lucky they are. They can meet Carolyn Steel this afternoon. I'm going to be very honest and say I teach at the Sorbonne, and I teach with Carolyn Steele's textbooks. They are compulsory for our students. She's written two magnificent books. First one in 2008 on hungry villages, or hungry cities. It's an extraordinary book that I recommend to you all. If you buy the book and don't like it, then drop me a mail and I'll refund you. That's something of a recommendation. And the other book is Citopia, which was published in France in 2020 when COVID first appeared. And the organization of food in cities came to be discovered. It's another remarkable book, and I'll refund you that too if you don't like it. So I'll just explain why it is we've chosen this topic, the topic of regenerating cities, because as Carolyn says frequently in her book, to nourish, to feed cities requires great efforts in the production and commercial systems. And when we do not succeed in feeding cities, what happens are revolutions, political revolutions. Perhaps she'll be talking about the Roman Revolution. She'll probably talk about the British situation, and I can tell you something about the French Revolution. But there is a link between political stability and the capability cities have to be nourished. What's interesting in Carolyn's book is the fact that she's an architect. It's not that she's a food specialist. She's an architect, and at some point in her life, as she'll be explaining, she felt affected not only by the question of food, but by the link there is between architecture and food. And that is why her work is quite outstanding, because she explains how cities have created how we eat, and how in her last book she has the daring and the nerve, one would say in France, to explain how food is going to save the planet. Is that right? Food is going to save the planet. And I think it's a very, very powerful message. And at Slow Food, it's clearly a message we like to present, because the majority of the world population lives in cities. But we do have the resources, as will be seen this evening, to understand how food can save the world. I won't say more because she has plenty of things to share with us. And then we'll be hearing from Nevin Cohen, who teaches at the City University of New York, one of the four great cities of the world with its beautiful Central Park that's not yet a permaculture park yet. Perhaps we'll be eating squirrels from Central Park one day, but for the time being, that's not about to happen. And he's going to be telling us about the role that this city has in how we imagine food in these gigantic metropolises. And if we have time, I'll also say something about Tokyo that I'm fairly well acquainted with, where we have a population of 37 million who have to learn how to feed themselves. So thank you. Over to you. Thank you for being with us. And over to you, Carolyn.
Shall I go and stand over there? Seems like a logical thing to do. Is that okay? Well, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction, Gilles, and I would say the check's in the post. That's very kind of you to talk about my two books, which I will also now try to explain a little bit more why I did come up with this somewhat crazy idea that food can save the world. And this is me kind of receiving the book for the first time. And you can see it's got a sort of slightly strange title, which I will explain. Sitopia is a word that I invented probably about 16 or 17, a long time ago now, more than 15 years ago, when I was writing my previous book, Hungry City, which Gilles also very kindly mentioned. And Sitopia just means food place. And it's from the Greek sitos for food and topos for place. And I will explain a bit more why I invented this word later on. But just to say that we live in a world shaped by food. We ourselves are made by food. By the time you're about 25, there's no atom in your body that was in you when you were born. So everything that we eat, we're made of the meals we've eaten. But of course, it's far more than that. It's also our landscapes, our cities, our economy, our politics, our climate, our relationships, our homes are all shaped by food. And I just thought we needed a word that said that. The reason I went Greek with it, I will explain later. Again, as Gilles said in his very kind introduction, the question of how to eat goes back a very, very long way. In fact, I think it's fair to say that as a species, we evolved through the conscious sharing of the problem of how to eat. And I love this picture of the Hadza, one of the few people in the world who still live predominantly as hunter-gatherers, because it tells you everything about where we've come from. And in a way, I would say it tells you everything about where we need to get back to, actually. Because what you see here is a sort of a perfect way of living in the landscape. Obviously, hunter-gatherers effectively live in the larder. But also, our ancestors over 1 million years ago had this enormous technological breakthrough, which was the discovery of how to harness fire. And of course, once you can harness fire, you can cook. And once you can cook, you can split up the way you work together as a group. And a certain number of people, usually men, go off hunting. And another group, usually women, stay around the fire and rooting for tubers in the ground and then cooking those tubers. And this means that if the hunters aren't successful, there's a backup meal. And that means you can specialize in hunting, and that's what our ancestors did. And meat is a very high-value food. Their brains got bigger, they got smarter. And if you also think about what they were doing in the evening as the hunters came back, maybe with, maybe without an animal that they'd killed, and the women had cooked tubers, they then shared that food out between them. And this, of course, is the shared meal that we all recognize, as a sort of central ritual in our lives. But what we don't often think about is the fact that this is how collaboration evolved, division of labor, the evolution of language, the evolution of, the sort of the hormones that ping back and forth and make us feel good when we're eating together. It's absolutely fundamental to who we are. And it's also both the first and the best economy we've ever invented. And I'm going to come back to the notion of economy a lot. Now, as I say, the question of how to eat is directly linked to the question of how to live. They map onto each other like that. I mean, they're absolutely directly linked. Now, obviously, if you're a hunter-gatherer, as I said, you live in an abundant landscape. You live directly in the larder. So there's no real contradiction between the need to eat and the need to do other things like socialize and so on. But when our ancestors started to live in cities, that all changed. Now, I'm going to be leaping through thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of civilization very rapidly in this talk. I always do, because I think it's fascinating to understand how profound and how fundamental food is at the core of our lives, even if we can't see it anymore. So if we look at this early city, we can immediately see that there's a sort of division of the landscape into an urban bit where people live and a productive bit where people are farming. And this division obviously then starts to split up the two necessary sides of our lives between the social on the one hand and the natural on the other. And there's a lot more to say about these early cities as well. But one thing to note is that in the center is the temple. And the temple, it was not only responsible for the spiritual life of the city, but its administrative life. And the most important thing that the temple did was organize the annual harvest. And it would gather in the grain, offer it up to the gods. Sorry to the two of you, Gilles and Nevin, that you can't see I know, but you can't see my laser that I'm using extensively. Anyway, never mind. Store it in the temple granary and then redistribute it through the city during the course of the year. So if we were going to ask how the first cities on Earth fed themselves, we would say that they were city-states. That means it's what I call the fried egg model of urbanity. If you think of the yolk of a fried egg as the urban bit and the white of a fried egg as the countryside around feeding the city, that's what most early cities were like. And I do know the story's more complex than this, don't worry, but I'm just giving you the basics of a sort of trajectory that got us where we are today. And of course, it's on a river, very, very important, because the water is not only allowing people to irrigate the land and bringing nutrients, but also allowed these cities to trade. And I'm going to talk a lot more about the importance of water in transporting food, because if you think about the problem of feeding a city, the problem number one is, what am I going to grow? And the answer to that is grain, which is why cities and farming co-evolved. And the second problem is, how do I transport the food? And the answer is that in the ancient world, it was about 50 times cheaper to transport food over water than over land, which explains why Rome was able to grow to the size that it did, as Gilles mentioned in his introduction. So most early cities had this kind of model. And another really fascinating thing is that for as long as we've been living in cities, which is not very long, by the way, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years people have been living in cities, so not long at all. But ever since we have been living in cities, we've been a bit worrying about how to keep this going. And the first people to worry about it in a systematic way were the Greeks, and that's Aristotle you're looking at there. And Aristotle's term, you might have, his familiar term, political animals. Well, what I love about this term is it talks about the division that I've just spoken about. The fact that as political animals, we need to be political. That means we need to gather in cities in order to be with one another. But we are also animals, which means we also need the natural world. So if you're going to live in a city, how do you bring those two things together? Now, what Aristotle said is what we need to have is a system called economia. What is economia? Well, it actually means household management. And the idea is that in an ideal city, that's actually Athens there, every citizen has a house and a farm, and the farm feeds the house. That is good household management because the house is self-sufficient. And obviously, if every citizen has this arrangement, then the city will be self-sufficient. And that's ideal because then the city isn't dependent on anybody else and it can be politically independent. So to the Greeks, economia was essential to the functioning of the state. And if that word looks or sounds vaguely familiar, it should be, because it's the word that gave us our modern word economics. Talk slower. Talk slower. Is that what you're saying? Slower, yes. Okay, too fast. Okay. Now, the most perfect example of this arrangement between the city and the country, for me, is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of the effects of good government. And you can see it here. It's a beautiful rendition of a city, a countryside, and a very harmonious, balanced relationship between the two. And if you look at this picture closely, you can see that this red wall that appears to be a division is actually a membrane. And moving constantly between the city and the countryside are people, animals, hunters leaving to go and shoot a boar, a pig coming into market, animals with grain on their back. Inside the city, there's a flock of sheep. There's a woman with a basket of eggs on her head. So what you're actually looking at is a perfect rendition of an active dynamic system, which is constantly rebalancing and referring to itself. But you see the city and country in a dynamic, symbiotic relationship. It's obviously a utopian vision, in the sense that it's kind of idealized, but it also, to me, represents something fundamental to urban civilization, which is that if you don't have this recognition of the importance of the relationship between the city and the country, you have imbalance. And when you have imbalance, you have externalities that you may not be aware of as a city dweller, but somewhere something bad's happening. Is this a better speed? Probably. Okay, now, as I don't have to tell you, we don't live in that kind of situation anymore. Most of us live in enormous cities. This is my home city of London, millions of us. And our food comes often from thousands of miles away. We don't see the food. It's out of sight and out of mind. And something I should have said before when I was gabbling is that critical to the Greek idea of ekonomia was that the city should remain small. Because only if the city remains small can that relationship between the farm and the household take place. So we've obviously completely gone away from that model. I call it the urban paradox, because it is a paradox, because as political animals, we need society, that's why we live in cities, but we also need nature. And the more we live in cities, in order to be together, the further and further away we get from our sources of sustenance. So how did we get here? Well, this is the slide that I wouldn't have had time for had Elena been here. So this is dedicated to Elena. This is Johann von Thünen. And he was a German landowner and geographer who, in 1826, wrote a book called The Isolated State. Now, the isolated state is a very strange place. It's flat, featureless, and fertile, and it's inhabited only by logical, profit-seeking farmers. And the question that von Thünen asked himself was, if a city is built in the middle of such a place, how does its productive hinterland naturally evolve? And he said, well, obviously, in the city fringes, you're going to have fruit and vegetables, because fruit and vegetables are very difficult to transport far because they get squashed. Fruit and vegetables are a luxury food, so the farmers can afford the high land rents, and also they can make good use of night soil, which is human and animal manure, which is saved in the city and then dumped on the ground to make it more fertile. So there you have, if you like, the golden ecological cycle that the pre-industrial city used to represent, of recycling its waste to produce more food. Then beyond that, you've got a band of about 20 to 30 miles, or let's say 35 to 40 kilometers, of grain production and other things like wood for fuel, but in terms of food, grain production. Grain, of course, as I briefly mentioned, is the critical food of cities and always has been, because it's easy to store. But actually, it's very hard to transport far over land because it's very heavy and bulky in relation to its value. That means that beyond a distance of, let's say, 40 kilometers, it was uneconomic for farmers to bring the grain to the city. This therefore limits the size to which the city can grow. Now, you can produce meat further away, that's livestock grazing, because the animals can walk to market, so they provide their own transport. But meat was never the food that kept cities going, because it was a seasonal food, a luxury food. The only difference that geography makes to this diagram is that if there's a navigable river, then these bands can extend further away from the city because you can take the food to the river and then bring it in much more easily and cheaply. So that's a very abstract diagram. I remember being lectured on as an architecture student and falling asleep. It was so abstract and boring. Now I find it fascinating because when you apply it to real places, it gets really interesting. Now, I'm conscious of time because I'm talking about a third my normal speed. So I'm going to have to go very, very fast and therefore not say, this is so fascinating, and I will start gabbling if I let myself. But just to say, here are two images. That's London at the start of the 19th century and Paris at the end of the 18th, so similar time. These are their main ports on the Thames and the Seine. I'm just going to ask you whether you can spot a key difference there. So something really critical and interesting different about those two images. Say out loud. Water. Well, they both got water because they're both rivers. Anyone else? Go on. Yeah. A prize to the lady in the white shirt. Exactly. These are ocean-going sailing boats, ships. These are river barges. Now, I don't have time to go into this, sadly. Gilles and I are going to have to go off and have a chat later. But I mean, this is the reason why France had a revolution and London did not. London was able to import its food from all over Europe. Paris was not. Therefore, the king was responsible for feeding Paris. And when the harvest failed, he was blamed. And I think most of us in this room know that ended badly with revolution. So you can never disassociate geography from politics. And this is just one example of why politicians hate being in control of food, because you can't basically control it. It tends to organize itself. And this is what Adam Smith actually noticed, you know, the father of capitalism, about London, is that it had a kind of free trade attitude to food. And one other thing I will say about these two images is that they go some way to explaining the otherwise completely incomprehensible phenomenon of Brexit. And now I'm going to have to kill myself because I said the B word. But it explains why the British have this, oh, just get it from anywhere, you know, all this global Britain nonsense. It all comes from geography. Anyway, moving on. And I have to apologize to all of you who are not from the UK, the way my country's behaving, but I'm going to move on. Now, I just have a time issue because I put too many slides in. I'll just say a few headlines for each group of slides and then move on. This is when von Thunen gets interesting, as I say. If you look at these maps of London, I just colored them up to show how the food was coming into the city. So this is in the pre-industrial era, and it's all about geography. That's his market gardens surrounding the city that he talked about. Grain is coming in by river because it's too heavy and bulky to carry easily over land. It's coming to the two main river ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate, and it's traveling up to Cornhill where it's being traded. And that's Bread Street on the way. So it tells you that food is literally traveling physically through the city. Fish is obviously also coming in by river. also coming into the river ports. Billingsgate, some of you may know, remained London's main fish market until 1984 on that site. And that's something else very interesting about foodways, is once they're established, they tend to last for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. They're very difficult to move. Meat, animals are obviously walking into markets, so they're coming from a completely different direction. They're coming to a smooth field outside Newgate, and that, of course, becomes Smithfield, which is still London's meat market today, although it's about to close down, which I find very sad and very long-sighted, or rather short-sighted. But you can see that the market, and I know this will feed into Nevin's talk a little bit, the market was the place where you went in the pre-industrial city to get food, but it was also the place where you went to socialize, to meet your friends, to find out news and gossip. They were the beating heart of the city. So in the pre-industrial city, there is a close tie between our need to eat, people's need to go to market, and sociability and public life. And that's a really important point that I think is going to thread into Nevin's talk whenever it happens in the next century. Sorry. Sorry, I normally get through having too many slides by just gabbling, but of course I can't do that. So I'm just going to do this like a cartoon. I'll just do headlines. It all changes when the railways come. So this is the moment when geography, cities are emancipated from geography, basically. 3 key things change. Cities now can be basically built any place, any size, any shape, because now it's possible to transport food rapidly over long distances. Secondly, food now becomes invisible. So animals are no longer going to be mooing outside your window. They're going to be slaughtered in the countryside and come in as dead meat. You don't see it anymore. Last but not least, politicians who've taken a certain degree of responsibility for feeding people now wipe their collective brows, say, thank goodness I don't have to do that anymore, let's leave it to the food industry. These all have profound effects on the way we eat today. That's a sort of graphic representation of the urban sprawl that resulted from the railways. London, that's London, very rapidly becomes a city you couldn't possibly feed from 1 or 2 markets that you can walk to. The landscape feeding a city changes and turns into that image I showed you earlier. So from grassland, herds of bison, and of course Native Americans, hunter-gatherers living with them, slaughter, and then leading to the first vast monocultural grain fields that would feed the modern world. Of course, this is also the invention of so-called cheap food. Now I have to pause here. There is no such thing as cheap food. Food consists of living things that we kill so that we can live. So if you say food is cheap, you're saying life is cheap. And yet, with industrialization, we created the illusion of cheap food. This is the Chicago stockyards, up to 17 million animals there in any one year, being fed on that grain that you just saw, which of course makes cows sick because they evolved to eat grass, not grain. But this was the beginning of the industrial system that we know today. Catastrophe upon catastrophe. I'll just run through these incredibly quickly. The famous Dust Bowl, when all the soil just blew off because it wasn't being tamped down by the bison anymore. It was, perennial grass turned to monocultural annual crops, and you can't do that forever without consequences. This is the beginning of the industrial versus organic conversation that you're all at Slow Food Terra Madre, so I'm guessing you're very familiar with this. So I'll gloss over it, move on. But it's very important, so we can come back to it if you want. And of course, the organic movement were winning that argument, and then war came along. And just as is the case with Ukraine now, when a war comes along, politicians panic, and they just say, okay, just grow food, I don't care how you do it, just grow a load of food. So that's when the industrial model with chemicals, destroying the soil, etc., really took over. Of course, after the war, the idea of a good life goes from being train-dominated to car-dominated. Remember that map of I showed you at the beginning, the fried egg? you've now got scrambled egg basically spread all over the best farmland, because suburbs are always built over good farmland. Why? Because they're built surrounding towns that were founded in places they could be fed well. So this is catastrophic. Of course, you don't have market. Nobody walks in this kind of landscape anymore. They drive to a box that simulates a market by sticking air conditioning and creating what's called eternal springtime. And of course, food is denatured because it has to travel all these weird pathways. So she's just popped out for a pint of milk, and she's come back by mistake with all this food that's feeding itself directly to her. We've also seen the dehumanization of the food system here. So I'm not going to a market and meeting a human. I'm going to a supermarket and meeting a box that's selling itself directly to me. So again, if you remember the ancient city where the politicians were feeding their people, now we have the food going where the money is. So this is a map of New York. The red bits are so-called food deserts, where you're more than 500 meters from a source of fresh food. And of course, they map onto the Bronx and Harlem and all these places where poor areas, basically, and areas of very high levels of obesity and bad health and criminality and lots of other issues. So this is basically what the food system looks like. This is some of the externalities that we've allowed to occur in this creation of this illusion of cheap food. You're very aware of most of these. Soil degradation, climate change, loss of fresh water, diet-related disease and obesity. Pandemics like COVID are directly related to the way we farm, the monoculture we're creating, the food waste, huge amounts of grain being fed to animals when it could feed us, huge amounts of energy being spent just to create a calorie of food, and a loss of biodiversity, actually meaning we're entering a sixth mass extinction. Now, unfortunately, this model is going global. Why? Because politicians aren't in control. The food industries are in control. Feeding people is incredibly powerful. You can make a lot of money out of it, and therefore we live in a sort of global cartel, effectively, that has no incentive not to spread this model. What are we going to do about it? Well, I think this is one of my favorite quotes. This is the English architect Cedric Price. This beautiful quote: "Technology is the answer, but what was the question?" So if you go back to that first image of all of our ancestors sitting around a fire, we've got better and better on one level at feeding ourselves and worse at working out how to live. And we've forgotten that those two things are directly linked. So I think the question goes back to the original question we've always been asking. How do you live well? How, if you're going to live in cities, do you balance nature and society? So it's back to those Greeks again. And this is a very consistent theme in Utopia. The Greeks worried about it, as I said. Thomas More, when he was worried that London was getting too powerful, he imagined a sort of fantasy island of a network of semi-independent city-states. And Ebenezer Howard with his garden cities, it's basically Thomas More with railways. It's the same idea. So make the city smaller, link them together, so everyone is close both to society and to nature. This is why I went Greek with my word Utopia, because utopia doesn't exist, can't exist. It's either a good place or no place, which means it's ideal, and therefore it's a fantasy. Whereas, as I said, we already live in Utopia. We live in a world shaped by food. We just live in a bad one because we don't value food. So what would it be like if we did value food? Well, we have choices. So food is basically coursing through our lives all the time, from the countryside to the city, through our bodies, back again, endless loop. Very complex. It's a complex system. We have choices. If we're going to eat meat, do we feed grain to cattle and have these CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations? Or do we let the cows eat grass, which is, by the way, why we co-evolved with them? Do we leave the city in the name of efficiency? Nevin's going to talk more about this. Or do we go into the middle of, he's going to talk more about the fact that food buying is no longer a social thing. Or do we actually go to a market and meet a human? Do we take time for food? So before the pandemic, 1 in 5 meals in America was being eaten in a car. So what is that? What kind of society are we creating, or do we take time for food? And the point is that we have to turn the question upside down. The question is not, how do we feed the world? I hate that question. There's so much that's wrong with it. Who's we? Who's the world? Does it want us to feed it? Feeding is what we do to animals, actually. It's just, everything's wrong with it. The question is, what is a good life? And what is a good life for, shall we say, 10 billion humans and who knows how many billions of non-humans to live together on the planet? And then what kind of food system and what kind of way of eating can get us there? So you have to turn the whole thing the other way up. It's about value, obviously. There is no such thing as cheap food, as I said. It's ironic that it's usually in times of crisis. This is the Second World War, Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, Detroit after the cars left, that people remember the value of food. They start cooking again, they start growing again, they start forming food networks. Of course, the same thing happened under COVID. It's about democratization, because our current food system looks like the one on the left. It's a monopoly, and we need to join the roots to the branches, the farmers to the producers. And that is effectively what Carlo Petrini, the wonderful, I have to say, it's so thrilling and exciting to be standing here at the Terra Madre talking to you. I think Carlo Petrini is one of the most important humans of the 20th and 21st centuries. And what he's created here, a forum for talking about these things, is just phenomenally important. But his idea of being co-producers, not just passive receivers of food, but actually actively involved, getting actively involved like citizens in the food system. And there are an infinity of models, of ways you can do this. Community-supported agriculture, food co-ops. I'm just whizzing through this because I'm way over time, of course. Farmers co-ops, or even institutions that allow small family businesses to thrive, like the food courts of Singapore. It's about incorporating food into the way we think about cities. People haven't been doing that for a long time. Making space for it, preserving peri-urban land for farms, putting food at the center of food policy, of city policy, creating food hubs that replicate the old markets, preserving infrastructure such as abattoirs, because if we are going to farm with animals, and there is a place for them, I believe, then you need a good death for the animals as well as a good life. Markets don't just kind of exist in the modern world, they have to be protected, as do independent producers and small shops. So this is all issues to do with planning. I think the debate that I skirted over about industrial versus organic is over. We know that we can't carry on farming chemically because it's basically killing insects, and if you kill insects, you've killed the whole ecosystem. But there's an amazing series of models, very exciting, about how we can farm with nature, and we can do this, by the way, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. And it's about bringing economia back. And my proposal, by the way, is that we internalize the true cost of the production of food. I think that's what we have to do. I think we need a new economy based around food, because food is the most valuable thing in our lives. And if we revalue it, everything that matters will come together. So that's my proposal. And it is also about bringing the city and country back together, as in the Greek sense. And this either means, again, it's planning, restricting the growth of cities so that they grow to a star shape, bringing productive land back into the city, interrogating productive hinterlands and seeing what can be grown, that's around New York, or building new cities that incorporate food production. It's about creating landscapes for human and non-human flourishing. And all of these kind of peri-urban food projects are really about that. Very excitingly to me, there's now a farm called Zootopia Farm in London, which I'm a trustee of. This is my not very kind of graphically competent summing up drawing. Basically, it's about saying that in the plate of food in front of you is the universe. That's the power of food. It's the most valuable thing that we share, that we have to work to produce. All of the world is in it. Love, economics, landscape, environment, our relationship with each other, but also with the natural world, is all in that bowl. And if we remember that every time we eat, we can create a better world. And by the way, a really good Citopia is very close to utopia. And if you want to know more, the books that Gilles is going to reimburse you if you don't like are here. And thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks to Slow Food and the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact for inviting me here today. I teach at the City University of New York, and I also direct the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, which engages in research, education, and action to advance just, healthy, and resilient urban food systems. And in the next few minutes, I want to suggest that the current battle is not between slow and fast food, but between slow, fast, and digital food. And that some of the things that Carolyn talked about are actually going to be turned upside down in the next decade. And this requires rethinking how food affects cities and how food can be a source of regeneration in cities. Over the last couple of days, I was involved in meeting with various people from the European Union projects that have been working to really create new efforts in cities to change the food system. Food Trails, Food Shift 2030, Fuzili, and others. And you can learn about them in the Food Trails tent across the way. These projects are developing innovative ways to improve urban food environments. They involve changing municipal food procurement to shorten food supply chains, creating farmers markets and other direct-to-consumer retail, helping low-income families afford healthy food, improving school food and other public canteens to support regional agriculture, and promoting urban and peri-urban agriculture. These are important initiatives, some of which I've been involved in moving forward, and they need to grow and be replicated. But as cities design and implement these policies, to improve the existing food system, the very foundations of the food system are shifting. And unless we consider the effects of digitalization on our food system, we risk repeating policy mistakes of the past. So when you leave this hall, take a look outside, take a look around you. The site of this year's Terra Madre is an apt metaphor for what I'm talking about. Look around us, and we're in what was called Torino's Iron Valley, named after the auto manufacturing plants that occupied these spaces. The crumbling structures that are left here are the remnants of Fiat and Michelin factories, reminding us of an economy and a landscape that once defined Torino but no longer exists. Every country has its own Iron Valley. Parco Dora is a beautiful example of urban regeneration, a combination of ecological restoration and historical preservation. But it's also a reminder of how rapidly seemingly well-established systems and practices can change. In the case of the auto industry, because of automation, robots, and globalization. And it's a lesson in the perils of not imagining and planning for new technological and economic realities. So what am I talking about in terms of food? Digital technologies have disrupted the entire food supply chain, from GPS-enabled precision agriculture that improves efficiency and, in some cases, reduces chemical inputs to agriculture, to apps that facilitate food sharing in cities. Over the past several years, digital food provisioning technologies in restaurant meal delivery, online food retail, and other services like nutritionally tailored meals and personalized nutrition apps have altered consumer access to different types of food and changed the way people shop and make dietary choices with huge impacts. The COVID pandemic dramatically increased adoption of online food retail. I don't know if there's a show of hands of how many people have ordered food online in this room. This is a slow food conference, yet okay, about half. While many consumers have resumed shopping in person, the future food environment will be a hybrid of in-person and online experiences. And this is not just a New York City or US thing. China is rapidly adopting digital, and countries in Europe with long traditions of public markets and small shops are too. I'm being dramatic because I'm on the stage, but these are real market shifts. A key question for us is the effect of digital food provisioning on things like diets and health and the food system overall, to ensure that we put in place the policies to make certain that the hybrid food environments support sustainability, equity, and health. Let me focus on the effects of digital food provisioning, buying food. There are a number of potential benefits from the digital economy. In theory, digitalization can make food buying more convenient and quicker and potentially less expensive, resulting in health benefits for populations with insufficient access to healthy food, the food desert map that Carolyn showed us before. Online grocery shopping offers easier access to a wider variety of food, expanding the range of grocers that consumers can shop in. Traditional neighborhood food environments are generally limited to a 20-minute walk from home, school, or work, but online food delivery substantially expands the neighborhood food environment by up to a 10-kilometer or larger radius. So it's changing the very geography of urban food systems. Online shopping cuts the time, cost, and physical effort of grocery shopping, facilitating access to groceries and reducing the burden of food provisioning. Online retailers increase competition among all food retailers and can shift the market in neighborhoods with very few supermarkets, potentially leading to competition and better quality and maybe lower prices for residents. And this is critical for, in New York City, 20% of our residents, 1 out of 5, depend on federal food stamps or SNAP benefits to put food on the table. 500,000 residents live in our social housing, earning about $30,000 a year compared to about $50,000 or $60,000 of median income in New York City. So we have a very large, very poor population, and online could, by increasing competition, drive down prices. And I know all the issues about, it's not about low-cost food, but it is making sure that people can afford food who need to put food on the table. As online shopping experience increases, consumers will comparison shop across online retailers, enabling consumers to find better quality, potentially lower cost products, although it exposes consumers to a large assortment of unhealthier as well as healthier products. There is some evidence that online grocery shopping and the temporal disconnection between shopping and receiving food may lead to healthier purchases by reducing impulse buying, as consumers are more likely to buy food with short-term benefits like taste rather than long-term benefits like health when access is immediate, the candy at the end of the grocery line near the cash register, then when the gratification is delayed by having it delivered the next day. But there are, and I'm not a booster for online shopping by any means, right? This is not me saying you should go out and begin shopping online. Let me mention several negative effects. Online food buying may result in less healthy choices. Consumers hesitate to buy perishable items like fresh produce online more than shelf-stable items that are highly processed and that don't vary in quality and freshness. There's this effect called lock-in, methods of reinforcing purchasing patterns online, like shortcuts to reorder previous purchases and saved purchase histories that can result in a lower variety of food buying. Digital retail facilitates nudging through price promotions and targeted messaging, something we call predatory marketing of unhealthy food, including things like nutrition advice that can be tailored to the person online, and that could be used for beneficial outcomes, offering meal planning tips to buy healthier items, and also bad outcomes through advertising of unhealthy food. There are also negative social impacts. For older adults, in-person grocery shopping is a source of social connection and physical activity, and its loss may have emotional as well as physical impacts. And if online grocers outcompete brick-and-mortar stores, the eventual impact over the next 10 or 15 years may be putting food retailers in your neighborhood out of business. There's a digital food divide. The health effects of online food shopping are likely to vary by socio-demographic status because of different access to things like high-speed internet and the computer hardware to make it easy to order online. And that may make the experience more difficult for lower-income households. Access to brick-and-mortar and online grocers varies by geography and the socioeconomic status of the customer base, particularly between urban and rural areas. Rural areas have fewer online grocers, and home delivery is often more costly because of the transportation costs, limiting the convenience and availability of online shopping to those who live outside cities. There's the Amazonification of food. In communities with limited food retailers, companies like Amazon or Walmart may be the only online retailer residents can access. And these giants have global distribution networks in place and can easily outcompete independent grocers, resulting in even more concentration in the food retail sector. There's an issue that we've been studying at CUNY, the exploitation of food labor. One outcome of the rise of digital food provisioning is the public health impact on the food delivery workforce. In cities like New York and Shanghai, bicycle delivery workers are everywhere, delivering prepared meals from restaurants and also groceries. But in many countries, these workers, like in the US, are mischaracterized as independent contractors and thus lack basic worker protections like sick leave and occupational safety and health protections. A growing body of literature suggests that the apps that control the jobs that they get and the pace of their tasks can cause negative mental and physical health outcomes, like stress and sleep disorders, and encourage risky behaviors like speeding and traffic violations that put them at physical risk. In addition, the algorithms that manage food delivery work practices reduce worker autonomy, resulting in negative effects on mental health, perceptions of unfairness, and low job and life satisfaction. And these effects occur because the algorithms monitor workers, set performance levels, assign tasks, schedule jobs, determine compensation, and make decisions about being fired based on work rates and performance evaluations by customers and formulas that optimize efficiency rather than human managers that make personal decisions. The environmental impacts of online food provisioning can be positive or negative depending on local geography and how the fulfillment process is designed and which effects are considered. We think about air pollution from delivery vehicles. These may exceed emissions from private cars in cities where shopping is done mostly by foot or bicycle, yet be more efficient in auto-dependent cities and suburban and rural areas, where individual households no longer have to drive their car to the market, but there's one delivery truck more efficiently delivering product. Solid waste from packaging of online groceries may be greater than for brick and mortar stores, especially if things are delivered in insulated containers and excess packaging like that. Fewer online distribution warehouses may facilitate food waste prevention, an issue that all of us care about, compared to dispersed brick and mortar stores by facilitating more efficient ordering and inventory control. But do we want those big warehouses delivering food instead of individual small markets? The urban planning impacts are likely to vary. I don't know if the term ghost supermarkets translates well, but these are retail locations used exclusively for fulfillment of online orders rather than by conventional consumers. If you go to many supermarkets in New York City, you see shoppers with their phones picking up orders from online customers and putting them into carts ready for delivery. You look around and there aren't actual customers in the store. These are ghost supermarkets. The increase in neighborhood warehouses for delivery platforms, especially for the new sort of 15-minute delivery companies, they're taking commercial spaces on high streets, main streets, and turning them into warehouses. The devaluation of these commercial spaces designed for supermarkets may have negative impacts, but the spaces currently devoted to food retail can be reconfigured for other needed uses, and the effects could be positive. And these uncertainties about impacts means there's an important role for activists, for you, and for policymakers, or for you to get the policymakers to take action. And this is what I want to suggest. It's important for policymakers, especially those who have worked and support sustainable food systems and have worked many years for policies to enhance physical food environments. Policies like offering subsidies for new supermarket development to promoting farmers markets. For those policymakers to analyze the effects, positive and negative, of the shift to an increasingly digital food provisioning system. Our existing efforts to improve the food environment risk becoming less effective or anachronistic and obsolete if food retail continues to shift from primarily brick and mortar retail to a mix of conventional and online purveyors, or in some cases entirely online distribution channels. Forecasting the types of impacts that will arise can help us develop policies and programs to ensure that the shift online improves health and sustainability and doesn't increase existing social and environmental inequities. And we need to study, replicate, and support positive digital opportunities, and I'll just mention four. One you may have heard of is Too Good to Go. How many people have heard of the Too Good to Go app? Okay, it's now the #7 food app downloaded from the Apple App Store. It allows restaurants and other food providers to advertise available food that would otherwise be discarded, usually at the end of the day, enabling consumers to buy the food at a really steep discount, both reducing waste, helping the restaurants get some extra income, and helping people to get affordable food. 2, digital choice food pantries. This is a uniquely American thing where we have hundreds in New York City, hundreds and hundreds of emergency food pantries that give away food for free. Emergency food providers are now using e-commerce apps to enable their clients to order food that they can pick up from the pantry prepackaged and ready to go and customized to their family's needs. This dignifies emergency food, gives consumers choices, and avoids judgment about what people choose to bring home to their families. 3rd, Get the Good Stuff. It's a program in New York City. When the pandemic hit, New York City did a number of things to help people who were out of work suddenly feed their families. They've piloted a program in which the city gives a stipend to low-income people who currently don't qualify for federal food benefits, usually because they're not legal residents of the US. The city worked with an e-commerce company called Mercado to create a digital platform that looks like an online supermarket, but limited to healthy choices, that links the participants to independent grocers in their neighborhoods that supply them with groceries that they buy. So they get $300 to spend on the Mercado platform, and a local grocery like Key Food delivers the food to them. 4th, the Hope Grocery Project, which we're evaluating. It's in rural Mississippi, in a poor Black community that has been disinvested for the last century. A nonprofit created a food hub that picks up and aggregates food that residents order online and distributes it at a community center where the residents can get other social services and meet each other. The program saves people from having to drive 30 or 40 minutes to the nearest Walmart to shop, and creates a center for people to come together to pick up their food. 5th, and finally, delivery worker policies. In New York City, the City Council and the Mayor's Office have passed laws and regulations to protect platform-based delivery workers, giving them the right to decline gigs that are unprofitable or dangerous without getting dropped from the platforms, requiring restaurants to allow delivery workers to use their bathrooms, prohibits the platforms from charging for the backpacks that the workers use for their delivery. And in the next several months, after a research project that the city agency did, surveying 70,000 platform-based food delivery workers, they'll be developing regulations to ensure that the compensation that they receive equals a minimum wage per hour. So in conclusion, I'm done. Place is really critical for food, and food is essential for creating place. I strongly believe that. I don't deny that. But in our digital world, the boundaries of the physical and virtual have been blurred, even for food, and they are blurring even further. And to ignore this is to put ourselves in peril. Ignoring the potential for new technologies to support a just, healthy, and resilient food system is as equally short-sighted as ignoring the robots that made it possible for other countries to produce fiats. And so let's pay attention. Thank you.
Merci à vous. Donc malheureusement, nous ne pourrons pas poser des questions à la salle.
Unfortunately, we will not be able to have questions But I hope that I'm going to put some feelers on this question, which has raised, yes, we can talk among ourselves, because what are the cities going to contribute to? I would like to ask one or the other of the speakers to talk about what do you think of this digital nourishment, something technological. Maybe it would, and also the fact that people are growing vegetables in the city, maybe we could separate it, because unfortunately, for the first time in the history of humanity, we will be able to eat nourishment which does not come from nature. We're talking about the digital food. We're talking about technologically made food. This is more than Neolithic.
My talk that if I'd had even longer to talk, I would have spoken about is I think we're facing a philosophical crisis. And that we have different paradigms of what a good life looks like. And one of them, in a way, is what Nevin was talking about, which is, just use tech, sort of grow meat in labs, kind of everyone has to live in the city, so nature goes back to being nature. And it's a way of sustaining a number of human bodies. But that is not a human life, a good human life, in my view. And I think we have to think very differently. And this is why I was saying in my talk, there's a problem with the question of how are we going to feed the world? There's so many problems with that formulation. We have to say, how can we live well together? What is a good life? And to me, this does require a fight, because as Nevin says, if we don't pay attention, the world he's talking about is what we're going to get. But we are also in an amazing meeting of thousands of people who care about food, so there is hope. But there's another alternative, and I think we who get food have to say to those people over there who are just trying to turn us into faceless consumers of highly processed mush, that we demand the freedom to eat food grown in a real landscape by real people, who are respected, who are protected, globally this is, because living close to nature is a very, very obviously good life if what you do is valued. So I think we've reached a moment almost of kind of philosophical crisis, that we've forgotten which question we need to be asking. And the question we need to ask is, as I say, collectively, what is a good life for humans and non-humans going forward? And food just happens to be the best medium through which to ask that question.
So I would like to clarify again. So I'm not saying that digital is good, and what I'm saying is that these technologies exist. They are blurring the definition of an urban food system. They are changing geographies as we speak. And we need to think creatively about how to harness the good things that they can provide. So, for example, I just learned this morning that the city of Birmingham, England, uses digital technology to connect consumers to farmers, basically a digital farmers market, essentially. And so we need to think about when technology can be used productively. I don't like the idea of lab-grown meat, but I think the challenge is also to develop the policies that make sure that as technology changes, as our habits and practices change, we are doing that in a conscious effort and not trying to undo problems that have already emerged in society. So, thank you.
Merci. Merci. Donc, cette question, évidemment, est...
Right, this question is clearly insoluble. We can't solve the problem this evening. But with slow food. But what I would like to do is to summarize the message that Carolyn and Nevin gave, and say that first of all, the role of cities in regeneration is very important, and that what we have to do is we have to bet on education. Our bet is education of people, because a lot of people are not commodities, but we're not walking commodities, and we have a very good example, because Carolyn was and is still an architect, because she has done exactly she has done geography, which is exactly what I do with my students. So it's very important to tell each other that what she was able to do is something that we're all going to do. You can be a doctor, a garage worker, but you can also be interested and involved in nourishment and all the things that underlie the food that you get. Education, our learning is extremely important. Learning when we buy, to fight the market traps, but also architecture is also being aware of space. And nourishment is the only thing that you put in your body, other than what the doctors have asked us with vaccinations. So it's very powerful on a symbolic level. Of course, there's medication too, but education is very important, because education in the vaster sense of the word, that is to say, and I repeat, if we have a job, whatever a job, we have to do what Carolyn did and take interest in things and exchange ideas and practices. And the second thing, which possibly we did not discuss, but which underlies both of their presentation, is what, as we called, democracy, the democracy of nourishment. We have to reseize power on our nourishment. Of course, imagining in the city parliaments of producers, we would meet the producers as parliament. Producers and consumers must meet, as slow food does. That's exactly what slow food is doing. And all those of us who are going to meet the producers Monday morning will think in a different manner. We will think of our coffee, our cup of tea, or our breakfast in a different manner. We have to leave behind us the market nourishment. We have to think locally. For example, in France, in the Nantes region, where, as you know, there was the idea of an airport strip, when we told the population that the airport project would have covered the best agricultural or farming land, at that point the debate changed completely. So it is very important that nourishment should have national, but also obviously local, especially local regulation. And to conclude, what can I do? What can be done? I would say, as Carolyn proved with the history of the transformation of nourishment by the markets in the city, with the city countryside relationship changing, we know that there is a price. When you say, well, okay, the poor don't eat well, it's not true. There are many rich people who also eat very badly, and it would be an insult to the poor to think that they are unable, simply because they haven't got much money, to eat well. Just for thousands of years, women were belittled. Now we can't belittle the poor. The good nourishment is not price-related, because the price, in any case, is something that you also think of in your head, but which must help us to avoid the trap thinking that good food is expensive and it's only for the rich. It's very important, this, because I believe strongly that we often have this underlying idea that, yes, of course, there are people who don't eat well, but, you know, it's not necessarily income related. And the last thing is that you should get to know your food stuff. Very often is the carbon issue. The new generation is going to help us also and learn what the energy balance is with the various foodstuffs. What is the role that, for example, pulses and legumes are going to have in the transformation of our foodstuff, because we know that we need proteins and that most of the proteins that are produced at very low prices, plant proteins are better. So we have to get better knowledge of our acknowledgement. All the things that we know, but which are facts and which we have to further develop. There are many young people here today, and I think we should follow the youngsters because they are the ones who bear the future. And it is extremely important to know that they are the ones who are going to change the way we eat, and that we should not make fun of them, saying they're vegetarians, they're people who like that. We have to take them very seriously because we are currently experiencing a transformation of the way in which we eat, exactly like what happened in the Neolithic age, because the desolidarization of nourishment, meaning that you no longer ate in solidarity, is very similar to the change that we're having today. And I would like to conclude and say, read Carolyn's books. And clearly with your mail, with my mail, because I told you, and this is what I tell my students, and what I tell the students of Nevin, read Carolyn's books. Personally, they have changed my work. Thank you, and have a good evening.